Hey guys, this is Adam from Premium Poker Tools, and in this video I want to kind of show you how I use this 3-bet Cbet Explorer tool to study, and just kind of give you my takeaways and my insights into what makes a 3-bet bluff profitable. So I'm going to start off by kind of putting in some default values, and then I'm going to talk about how different variables affect the profitability of 3-bet bluffing. So let's say they open to 3, we 3-bet to 9. Let's put in kind of like, a 25% opening range for them, so maybe they're in like a later position. And let's say that they continue versus our 3-bet about 50% of the time. Okay. And now let's say that they're 4-betting us with just aces and kings. I think that's pretty typical. A lot of people don't have the 4-bet bluff in their arsenal, and they're not really 4-betting light. So let's say aces and kings is what they're 4-betting. Let's say that we're in the cutoff, so there's 3 people left to act, button, small blind, big blind. And let's say that each of them is going to be 4-betting 1% of the time, so they're also 4-betting aces and kings. Let's say that we cbet to half pot, and they're continuing 50% of the time. Let's say that we hit the flop 5% of the time, which is going to be what all non-pocket pair hands basically hit the flop. And on each street, they're going to, like if we hit the flop, we can expect them to continue 50% of the time on each street. And finally, let's compare this 3-bet Cbet line to an EV of 0. So assuming that if we don't take this line, that we would fold. So those are the assumptions we're going to start with, and then we're going to kind of look at each one of these inputs, each one of these variables, and see how important it is to kind of the end result. So the first thing to think about is how often that they fold versus your 3-bet. Like, that's probably the most obvious and most intuitive thing, and I'm sure you can see that that's a pretty important factor. If they're continuing a lot versus our Cbet, 75–80% of the time, that's going to really be negative EV for us. But if they, let's say on the other hand, they're a little bit nitty, and when they see a 3-bet, they look to find the fold button, now we have a pretty profitable 3-bet right here. So if they're only continuing, let's say 20% or 25% of the time, now we're pretty profitable. And in a more general sense, we can see that just looking at this graph, the slope of this graph kind of tells us how significant of a factor this is right here. And you can see the slope is, relatively steep. So as they continue more and more, our EV goes down pretty quickly. So this is a pretty important factor. And let's see, I have some notes here about continuing versus 3-bets. So I'm going to move this to the side. So generally, 50% is a pretty good number to target if they're continuing less than 50% of the time. So, here and to the left, it's usually going to be a pretty profitable 3-bet bluff. That's going to depend on the other inputs, like how often you get 4-bet and how profitable your Cbets are. So at different values for these inputs, the 50% number is going to change. But if you're against an unknown and you think that all the other inputs are going to be pretty standard, like 50% is a good number to target here. If they're folding more than 50% of the time, you're usually pretty good. And you can see here there's some typical values of what people continue with versus 3-bets. And I got this from the book The Grinder's Manual, which is a great book. And, most people are only continuing 40 to 50% of the time. So that kind of meets this threshold that we're looking for here. So 3-betting is actually going to be profitable a lot. And I think that makes sense because we see that a lot of really successful players, they 3-bet a lot, and it kind of makes sense that that's generating a lot of profits for them. I know Alex Fitzgerald has some videos and some books, and I thought it was really interesting. These databases that he has show, even hands like 7-5 suited or something, that when people 3-bet those hands in position, that their database usually shows a profit. So I think that it's pretty interesting how profitable 3-betting really is. And I want to talk about this because so I was reading the Grinder's Manual last night, and there's a chapter on 3-betting, and he made a point that I really liked, where there's a lot of situations where 3-betting any two cards will be profitable. So even if you have 7-2 offsuit, just based on the frequencies that they're continuing and defending, you'll probably have a profitable 3-bet cbet line. And if that's the case, then why not just 3-bet cbet every hand? And the answer to that is because if you start doing this with any two cards, people are going to figure you out. So in the short term, you might have a couple profitable plays, but in the long run, they'll figure you out, and then your edge will go away. They'll start to defend more, and you won't have as high of an EV. So you kind of have to balance the short term with the long term, that even if you do have a plus EV play, you gotta have to think about keeping things a little bit more on the down low so they don't figure you out. So that's something to think about. And then on the other hand, there's going to be, some opponents will never figure you out. They're just playing their two cards and not paying attention, and in that case, you can just abuse them. Or if you're, let's say, on vacation somewhere playing against some opponents and you're only going to be playing, 100 hands or something, then you can kind of get a little bit more crazy. But if you're, let's say, a 1-2 grinder in Vegas and you play against the same opponents a lot, that's more of a situation where you have to think about the long term. Okay, so, those are some comments. Another is that if you're playing online and you don't have a HUD, so like for me, I play in Nevada at World Series of Poker, and they don't allow you to have a HUD. But what they do allow you to do is to track your opponent, to have notes on your opponents. So I think it's really important to keep track of what your opponents are doing versus your 3-bets. And I know I like, this is my favorite line, the 3-bet cbet, so I keep track of how often they defend versus the 3-bet, and then how often they defend versus a cbet after the 3-bet. And I know that there are some opponents that they're only defending versus the 3-bet maybe like 20% or 30% of the time. And to me, those are great targets. Like, I like to target them a lot. So that's something to do. And finally, so you want them to be folding a lot versus your 3-bet. And, for that to happen, you want them to have a wide opening range. So let's take a look here. So here, if they're opening 25% of hands, there's a lot of hands here that they can plausibly fold to a 3-bet. They can fold 10-8, Jack-8, Queen-8, these kings, these offsuit Broadway kind of stuff, the lower pocket pairs. There's a lot of things that they can plausibly fold to your 3-bet. Whereas if they started out with, let's say, like a 10% range, now what are they folding to your 3-bet? There's so many strong hands here, like maybe some of these things at the bottom a little bit, but in reality, there's just so many strong hands that it's going to be hard for you to generate folds. So what I like to look for is like a 15 to 20% opening range. If they're opening that many hands, they have enough weaker stuff that will fold. So yeah, to kind of figure out what their opening range is, and if it meets that threshold, there's a couple kind of target hands that I like to look for. So like, weak offsuit Broadway hands, like those all are signs that they're hitting 20%. If they're opening like weaker suited connectors or suited one gappers, that's a sign that they're going to hit 20%. Weaker suited kings, even maybe weaker suited aces, like that's a sign that those are the kind of hands that you want them to be opening, because that means that they're opening wide enough where they'll be folding to 3-bets. So that's been the first factor, and that's kind of the most intuitive one, that if you're 3-bet bluffing, you want them to be folding to your 3-bet. So now let's move on to a second factor of the potential of you getting a 4-bet. So how important is it to factor in like whether you're going to get 4-bet or not? And the answer to that basically is that if they have non-trivial 4-bet ranges, if the people behind have non-trivial 4-bet ranges, then it becomes something to worry about. But if they have trivial, like aces and kings 4-bet ranges, then it's not that big a deal. So let's take a look at that. So I'm going to, let's say this is their opening range. And now let's say that they continue, 50% of the time. Let's say they're 4-betting aces and kings. We're on the cutoff. And each person behind is going to 4-bet 1% of hands, so kings plus. Okay, so let's start off on the button. We see the break even is 59%. Now let's move down to the cutoff, hijack, low jack, middle position. We see that it moved from 59% down to like 54%. So having more players like behind that can 4-bet you, it didn't really change things that much. And that's because each of them is 4-betting so infrequently. So when they have such trivial 4-bet ranges, it doesn't really matter how many people are like behind you. You don't have to worry about them so much. But if let's say now we go back to the button and we say that they're 4-betting 3% of the time, so that's like a jacks plus ace king kind of range. Now as we move to worse position, so we're on the button, so cutoff, hijack, low jack, middle position, now it moved all the way down to 35. So that was a pretty big jump. So now when we're in middle position and we have all these people behind us, now we have to worry. Now we can't just 3-bet blindly because we have to worry about one of them 4-betting us. So the thing to look for is whether people behind you are capable of 4-betting like a non-trivial range. And I'm going to move this back to the defaults. And one other thing to think about is that even if the people behind you are all, really tight 4-betters, if this initial person who opened has a bunch of bluffs, 4-bet bluffs that he's capable of pulling off, then that's another thing to worry about. So those are the two factors with 4-betting to think about. If the people behind you have non-trivial 4-bet ranges, you want to be careful. And if the initial raiser is the type to 4-bet bluff, then you have to worry a little bit more as well. Okay, so that was 4-bets. Now let's move on to c-betting. How much does it matter? Let's go to over here. Like how often they're continuing versus our c-bet. Like how big of a factor is this right here? And as you can see, this actually matters a lot. Initially, I was talking about defending versus the 3-bet, but I think that defending versus the c-bet is actually a more important factor. So let's check this out. So this table here, it shows at different, so like if they're, let's look at this row right here. If they're continuing versus your c-bet of half pot 40% of the time, then they need to be defending versus your 3-bet 89% of the time. Okay? So if they're not defending versus your cbet enough, then they have to be defending versus your 3-bet like a huge amount. But most people aren't going to be defending 89% of the time. So if you're against one of these people who are pretty fit or folds who don't defend versus the cbet enough, like, you probably have a profitable bluff. So let's take a look at this. So we cbet half pot. If we move this down to 40, like, look at how the graph changes. Like, now all of this stuff opened up as profit. So before, if they're at 50, if they're defending versus the cbet, or sorry, the 3-bet 70% of the time, it's negative EV for us. But if we bump this down to 40, now this is pretty plus EV. And as we play with this, we can see that the graph is like pretty sensitive to how often they continue versus our cbet. So like, this is a really important factor, as we can see. And I mean, my biggest takeaway here is that if we're against like a fit or fold kind of opponent, like, you know, if they only continue 30% of the time, we have a huge auto profit. I mean, we're making a ton of money right here. So if you have a guy that's gonna call your 3-bet and then fold the flop a lot, like, you're gonna be making a lot of money. And even if they fold like 45%, or if they continue 45%, like, it's still hard for them to be defending 72 versus the 3-bet. So I just love how sensitive this graph is to how often they continue versus your cbet. So, you know, look for people that are defending less than 50% of the time. Once we hit like 45, 40, 35, like, now we're making a ton of money. So honestly, that's been my favorite takeaway of studying with this tool, is to see how important the initial cbet is. What else did I have to say here? Yeah, fit or fold people less than 50% of the time. Here are some typical values of what people continue versus cbets with from the Grinder's Manual. And you can see that, you know, a lot of people don't really defend quite enough. I mean, I don't know. So here's a thing that I want to say also. Let's go over here. So they open, and then they continue versus our 3-bet. Once, like, when they're continuing, their range is actually pretty strong, right? So that's kind of a factor that maybe they're going to be defending more often because they're entering the flop with a strong range. But then on the other hand, we have a strong range as well. So we 3-bet them, and we are, you know, let's assume that we're in position. That's going to make it harder for them to continue versus our cbets. So those two factors kind of, you know, it's like a seesaw. One of them pushes you one way, the other pushes you the other way. And I'm going to leave that to you to think about in your specific situations, you know, how strong each factor is and what you think your opponent is doing. The main thing I wanted to show you here is just how sensitive the graph is to this input. Okay, let's see. So now we're kind of on to the last input here, and this input is about getting paid when you hit the flop. So most hands that are, I mean, pretty much any hand that's not a pocket pair is going to hit the flop 5% of the time. So, you know, this isn't really going to change much. We can't really play around with this because that's just how hands hit the board. And even if we do play around a little, we can see it's not having a huge drastic effect. But we could ask ourselves, like, what if we're against someone who, you know, is going to pay us off a lot? So let's like bump these numbers up to 75. So, that has some impact. That's making it a little bit easier for us to generate a profit by 3-betting. It's not huge, but it's something. But the thing here is that if we bump these numbers up, then we're against someone who's more stationy, and we probably have to bump this number up as well, and that's going to really hurt us. So that's kind of how I think about this factor. It doesn't seem too important to me, because if we bump it up, we're probably going to have to bump this one up as well. Like, unless we're against a very specific type of opponent who, calls the flop at a normal rate, but becomes more stationy on the turn and river. Like, that's when this would start to have more of an effect. And like I said, it has some effect, but it's not too huge. So the last thing I want to say is that, so this input right here, I forget the term for this. It's like a term from statistics. It's I wrote it down. Biphasic. So if you graphed how different hands hit the flop, there would be like two humps basically. So what I'm trying to say is that it's either going to be around 5%, or if you have a pocket pair, it's going to be 12%, because that's how often pocket pairs like hit a set or better. So if we put 12 in for this, like if we're going to 3-bet with like pocket threes, you can see that that drastically changed the graph. And I remember when I first started to study with this, my first thought was like, oh my god, this is amazing. I'm going to start 3-betting pocket threes all the time. And I'm not saying that that's a bad idea, but here's what you have to think about. If you do have pocket threes, if you flat with your pocket threes, that's probably going to be plus EV as well. So if we say that flatting has an EV of 1.5, now we're kind of back to where we started. So what I'm trying to say is that you have to compare the EV of this 3-bet Cbet to your best alternative. So let's take a look over here. Like here, if they're defending 75% of the time, we're plus EV, we're at 0.71 big blinds. So it would be profitable to 3-bet Cbet, but we probably don't want to do that, because flatting is going to be more EV. It's going to have a higher EV. So even though that we bumped this number up and it gave us all of these plus EV 3-bets, they're not higher EV than flatting. So just because these are all plus EV doesn't mean we should be 3-betting. So we kind of have the same break-even percentage here. So yeah, hopefully that made sense. It's kind of hard to articulate, but what I'm basically getting at is that I don't think this section has too big of an influence on things. If you're going to bump this number up, you also have to bump this number up. And if you're going to bump any of these numbers up, you're going to also have to bump this number up, and all of those effects seem to balance each other out pretty well. So let's go back over here and kind of wrap this video up. So what we're talking about is 3-bet bluffing and then c-betting the flop. Like, when can we take that line, and when is that line going to be plus EV for us? And my 3 takeaways, I'll write this down. One is that to target fit or fold people. So we saw in the cbet section that if they're not defending the flop, you're going to crush them. Let me just go back to that because I love to see it. So we're going to put this back to 5. I mean, this just makes me so happy. If they're defending the flop 35% of the time, we're crushing them. So that's my first takeaway, is that if you're against a fit or fold opponent, on the flop at least, you're going to crush them. Second thing is that we want to generate folds versus our 3-bet. And that's pretty straightforward. We're 3-bet bluffing them, we want them to be capable of folding versus our 3-bet. We can see the steepness of this graph right here tells us that the more they fold, going this way, the more they fold, the higher EV it's going to be for us. So that's pretty straightforward. And then finally, about worrying about the 4-betters, where was that? Here we go. We only need to worry about 4-betters when they 4-bet light. So only worry about 4-betters if they're 4-betting something that's non-trivial. If they're 4-betting a trivial range, we don't have to worry so much about the people who are behind us. So again, those have kind of been my takeaways from exploring this tool, but there's a lot more that you can do with it. There's all these variables. You can play around and see what kind of situations will give you profitable 3-bet bluffs. And I'd really love to hear kind of the results of your study. I'd love it if you can shoot me an email down here and let me know what you guys find and comment on the video. And if you guys have any questions, definitely hit me up. If you'd like to study together, I'd love to Skype with you or something, play around and see what we can find. But yeah, that's been this video on 3-bet Cbet bluffing. I'm Adam, I'm the founder of Premium Poker Tools, and thank you guys for watching.